We're really excited to kick off this first of what we hope will become a series of lunch and learns throughout the rest of the year and beyond. And what we're really hoping to do is, again, as Jenny mentioned, is really have this be a conversational learning opportunity for folks in a way that is relevant for your work and hopefully gives you more insight into areas of our shared work that maybe you don't have specific insight into yet, or just are hoping to learn more about. So after this, you will, if you registered for the Zoom, which I think everyone here did, you'll receive an email from me later today with a link to a survey where we'll ask for feedback about today's session and also invite you to share any ideas that you might have for future lunch and learn topics. And even if you'd like to nominate yourself to help us lead and organize one of these lunch and learns, we would love that too. So stay tuned for that, and also stay tuned for more information coming up about our plans for the next lunch and learns and throughout the rest of the year. So now I think let's go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Annemarie Hindman and Dr. Barbara Wasik, both at Temple. Annemarie and Barbara, would you like to introduce yourselves?
Sure. So hi, I'm Annemarie Hindman. I've been at Temple in the College of Education and Human Development for about 14 years. Hanging on for 15 because like we get a little gift, you get like a pen or something. So Barbara's been there longer. She can tell me what you get for 15. But I'm in the teaching and learning department and manage our early and elementary teacher preparation program. Barbara, how about you?
Hi, I'm Barbara Wasik. I'm a professor at Temple University along with Annemarie, and I can't remember. I think it's 15, 16 years I've been there, and I'm in the College of Ed in the teaching and learning department. And both Annemarie and I teach early literacy and learning.
So we're really thrilled to be here with you today. Thanks very much.
Yeah. And before we turn it back over to you, if I'd like to just invite all of our guests in the chat to just introduce yourself briefly, tell us your name, your organization, and as an icebreaker, just one word to describe how you're feeling today. So we'll look for those intros in the chat, and now I will stop sharing my screen and hand it over to you, Annemarie.
All right. I will start sharing my screen then. So excited to learn a little bit about who is with us today and how we can be most helpful to you. What we will do, the title of our mini talk, is The Science of Reading, what we know, what we don't know, and what it all means for you. And we're so thrilled to be here because Barbara and I have been in the field of reading research for quite a while now, and we are always happy to talk to a captive audience about what we know, what we don't know, and very excited today to hear from you. So we're going to give you a quick overview of why learning to read in English is or can be very difficult, how the science of reading can help with that, but also how our current knowledge base really leaves some important questions unanswered. And so not coincidentally, most of our time today will be spent in a question and answer with folks so that we can hopefully respond to some needs that you have, and we can talk things through together. So with that, let's kick it off with the first point we'd like to make, which is that learning to read in English can be very, very hard. You've probably noticed this if you work with children and families, perhaps in your own journey toward learning to read in English, if you have kids at home or somewhere in your life that you're helping. It's a very complicated language. For example, back to basics here, we have 26 letters in the English language, but actually, if you think about it, 26 is kind of a lot to begin with. But if you think about it, there are really 52 different shapes if you consider upper and lowercase letters. And sometimes the uppercase and lowercase letter looks alike for the same letter, but sometimes it's different. And then each of the letters has a name, but that name may or may not help you figure out what sound or sounds it actually represents. For example, the letter A sometimes makes the sound A, but sometimes makes a totally different sound A. The letter P does not make the sound P, it makes the sound P, which you can hear right at the beginning of the name of the letter, but that's pretty confusing. Some letters can make more than one sound, like letter A, and then of course some sounds, many sounds, are made by more than one letter. So there's a lot going on in English, and if you would like the technical term, we refer to English as an orthographically opaque language, meaning that the orthography, the mapping of letters to the sounds they represent, is not consistent. It is not transparent, it is opaque. So just to give a little example here, if we think about a couple of perhaps common letters and words that we know well, here we have letter F, which again just starts with the sound eh, if you say F, but actually makes the sound that comes at the end of its name. And it can go with other letters to make particular words. Like here we have fur, F-U-R, like as in my cat has a lot of fur. That's all good. But then there are actually other words in the English language that are pronounced exactly the same way, but spelled differently and have a different meaning, like fir as in the fir tree. And then if you just add one little letter to the end of fir, you get fire, which would be really bad for a fir tree. So it's a very different meaning, but just the addition of one little letter. And then, of course, you have words like our very own Philadelphia, which has two F sounds in it, Philadelphia, but no Fs actually in the word. So just there, simple example of how complex English can be and how difficult it can be for many folks to learn to read in English. As a result, and of course, my personal favorite, I forgot about yacht, just a good example of a word that is not pronounced anything like what you would think it would be pronounced like, given the way we consider letters and sounds to typically go together. So not surprisingly, reading difficulty is quite common among kids and also adults, but today we'll focus particularly on children. About 20% of kids will struggle with dyslexia or related issues, really substantial challenges in learning to read in English. Even broader than that, we have an assessment, like a test that is given pretty much every year called the Nation's Report Card. And there's a piece of that that's given in reading, nationwide assessment, and it's given to fourth graders and eighth graders every year. We commonly find, and this has been unfortunately the same for over a decade now, that among children in poverty, about half don't read with even basic reading proficiency by fourth grade, again in English, and that's pretty unchanged by age 8. And if you look at children who are English language learners, the number of kids who are struggling goes up to like 75 or 80% of kids when you think about who can read with basic proficiency. So when we talk about these gaps, we want to be careful to explain that these numbers, these reading difficulties, don't reflect deficits in learners, but rather they reflect the challenge of the language that we are trying to teach them. And so the fact that we keep seeing these challenges in reading across the nation really reflect that we need to help kids tackle reading in English differently. So we need to have some different strategies in place. The science of reading can help us think about what strategies might actually work. The science of reading is a collection of empirical studies that have been collected over the last 30 to 40 years that help us understand the nuts and bolts of how children learn to read. So you might think of science, and I certainly did when starting in this field, as sort of like lab coats and beakers. And there is some of that in the science of reading. There are studies that involve brain scans and electrodes on your head, thinking about what parts of your brain light up. But most of this work actually happens in classrooms every day and in homes as researchers sort of try to understand what teachers can do and what families can do. So the science of reading helps us sort of separate fact from fiction. There's a lot of information in science of reading, a very big collection of research papers and books, but we wanted to boil it down to really 3 big ideas for you today. So we're kind of generalizing here, but we think they're 3 useful big ideas. The first one is that becoming a fluent reader requires multiple skills, not just one thing, multiple things coming together. So you may have seen this graphic before. This is often referred to as the reading rope, and it was developed by Hollis Scarborough, who's a scholar of reading development. So what you have here, there's a lot going on in this picture, but what you have here are a number of individual skills, background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures. And each of those is really like a category of things with individual skills underneath it. So under background knowledge, we're talking about knowing facts or concepts about the world. Under vocabulary, we're talking about how many words you know and how well you know each one. So a collection of skills that all individually contribute to reading. And any one of them doesn't take you to reading, but you kind of need all of them all together. So you can see each individual thread here weaving into a broader rope, which eventually describes skilled reading. Scarborough also helped us to think about the fact that there's sort of 2 big categories that she identified of skills. You got a bunch of skills that have to do with understanding language, your background knowledge, vocabulary, also language structures, how words go together, like syntax and semantics, verbal reasoning, being able to make sense of inferences and metaphors, and literacy knowledge, understanding that letters actually represent something and that printed words have messages in them, and that different kinds of genres will have different kinds of messages and operate in different ways. So there's a language comprehension bundle of stuff and also a word recognition bundle of stuff. In order to recognize words, you need to have an awareness of the sounds in words, the ability to recognize and manipulate those, phonological awareness, decoding, being able to sound out words, knowing the letters and which particular sounds they represent. And then some words you need to know by sight recognition, particularly familiar words, and that grows as you get older. So there's a lot of stuff going on, many strands woven into reading together. And that gives you some insight into the breadth of things that are actually happening, and also how complicated this is for young kids to begin to put together. Apart from what Hollis Scarborough also said back in 2001, we also know now that there are a collection of other skills that kids need too that aren't included in that reading rope. So don't forget attention and emotion and motivation. So here we have a picture of a child looking at a book, and you can see sort of a look of frustration, maybe even boredom, and that stuff matters. The extent to which a student can pay close attention to what's happening, to the letters, to the sounds, to the meaning of the story really matters for how they learn to read. Their emotion, their affect around it, their motivation, the sense that they can do it even though it may be quite difficult. Those things matter as well. And if you're curious, some work by Carol Connor there and also Alan Whitfield on the motivation side of things are good places to look for more information. So at the end of the day, the science of reading tells us that reading is really comprised of a bunch of different things. But for our purposes today, we're going to think about three big clusters of things: meaning and language, knowing the meanings of different words, how they fit together, how to understand inference and make sense of what you're reading. Code and word recognition, so knowing your letters, the sounds they make, and how those map together, and knowing your sight words. And then also this sort of more affective bunch of things: attention and emotion and motivation. So that's big idea number one. Big idea number two is that each of these individual skills develops over time. So you don't just wake up one day and become a reader. Instead, you're building the foundations for this, or certainly can be, over time. Each of these individual skills has its own little pathway from beginning to fluency. Here's just a look at one. This is a pretty nice map of how over time phonological awareness and phonemic awareness increase. So you can see kids start by thinking about the sounds in words as they relate to syllables and being able to tell syllables apart. And then over time, they become sensitive to the individual sounds within words. So you know that catfish is 2 syllables initially, but as you become more sophisticated and more knowledgeable about the sounds in words, you can actually tell that catfish starts with k and ends with sh. And you can discern the individual phonemes in between those and then mix them all around. So that's a long trajectory here just for phonological phonemic awareness. Each of the skills we talked about back in that rope has its own developmental trajectory. We have some really good maps of that, but it's a lot to take into consideration as a teacher and a lot for kids to actually do. Big idea 3 is, as much as these maps are beautiful and we know on average what is happening for kids, we also know what kinds of points in time might represent markers of problem areas. If kids are struggling with certain things by a particular point, we can talk more about that. We know that kids develop these skills differently. So not everybody's trajectory looks the same. There are a variety of reasons for this. As we mentioned, some kids will have significant difficulty, including diagnoses of dyslexia. Other kids will have difficulties in one area, not in others. Some kids will be enormously talented in all 3 areas and speed through the process of learning to read. But kids are going to go about this differently. That means that reading and being in a classroom is awfully complicated. So if you think about a classroom through the lens of the science of reading, you kind of would hope that the science of reading would give you sort of like a magic bullet or like a decoder ring of exactly when to know there are problems and what's going on. But the science of reading in some ways just gives us a handle on how complicated everything actually is. So if you look at a classroom, and you think about what's happening in this classroom. I believe this is a second grade classroom that I randomly pulled from the internet. You've got a teacher here teaching word recognition and language comprehension skills, and also supporting attention and emotion and motivation. So that's one piece of what's going on here. The science of reading tells us also that kids are coming to this classroom with very different backgrounds and very different knowledge around reading. So what they need in terms of word recognition and language comprehension teaching is going to look pretty different. And kids are going to pick up these new skills really differently. And they want a variety of things, motivation, their background knowledge, and what kind of learners they are. So that's a really tall order, right? There's a lot going on there. The science of reading is really good at picking out all these different things we need to pay attention to. Unfortunately, the science of teaching reading lags pretty far behind the science of reading, which is a problem because if reading is so difficult to learn and consequently so difficult to teach, raises a lot of questions about, well, how do we do that? What are the best ways that we can do that? And we don't have as many answers as we wish that we did. Just a quick acknowledgement to Jenny Bagoni and her colleague, Monroe Richardson, who came up with the idea of the science of reading on one hand and the science of teaching, or teaching reading on the other hand, which we have promptly stolen for our own use and will make use of today. We thought that was a really excellent distinction. If we're going to teach kids to read in English, we're going to need both of these pieces together. We've got a lot of knowledge here around the science of reading, but a lot less around the science of teaching reading. But all is not lost. We still know some things, and we'll talk about that. So we know a lot about the what. Kids need to learn letters, and they need to learn sounds, and they need to have executive function skills and pay attention. We also know some things about the how, but we wish we knew more about the how. And that's really where the rubber meets the road right now in trying to tackle this challenge of increasing literacy in there. So we know some things. That's the good news about teaching reading. If we go back to sort of our model of what the science of reading tells us we should be paying attention to within our learners, they need to know things about, they need to know vocabulary, they need to know how words go together, they need to know how to make sense of what they're reading. They also need to know individual letters and sounds, be able to decode and be able to recognize words. And they need this sort of like fund of affective or emotional skills. There are lots of things we can do to support meaning and language. Lots and lots of things. But in one slide, I tried to pick my top 5 and Barbara okayed it. So I think we agree. Here are 5 things that we know from the science of learning, the science of teaching, are things that support the meaning and language piece of learning to read. And some of these things are very simple points that you probably do every day, but they are directly related to one or more of these sort of triangles of reading. So asking open-ended questions, waiting for kids to respond, and then giving them feedback on those responses. That is hugely important for kids' building of meaning and language skills, and in turn for their learning to read. Even if the questions you're asking aren't about the code of reading, anything you're talking about, as long as you're giving kids the chance to use their own language, think critically for themselves, and express that, and then offering them some feedback, that's really powerful. Telling stories in the classroom, encouraging kids to tell stories, even reminiscing about things that have already happened is a kind of storytelling. Reading and discussing new books, sharing new words and ideas about a new topic. All of those things support meaning and language. Taking a look at the code-related piece, using rhymes or singing songs is absolutely a way to teach code. Studying word patterns and variations, that's something that teachers will be doing a lot of using their structured phonics program. Supporting writing and composing. We think a lot about reading, but writing is sort of like the handmaiden of reading, and a really great way for kids to pull together these different meaning and code focus skills. So writing is important. Encouraging independent reading is a critical way to support kids' code-related functioning. And also investigating base and root words, really getting into how language works, why some words have silent G's in front of them and others don't. There's a reason for it. Come from the same place. And then if we think about what supports these attention and emotion motivation skills, I think everybody off the top of their head probably has their own top 5. Some we selected are explicitly teaching social and emotional and organizational skills, allowing kids to move around and be engaged and sort of opening up opportunities for them to learn, offering choices and activities, providing support as they need it, and encouraging kids to seek support. We call that help seeking. And then of course, offering praise and encouragement, another way to build attention, emotion, and motivation. So these are all a series of evidence-based practices, by no means all of them, but a pretty reasonable sampling of things that folks can do in any context, really in any context, to help kids learn to read. You can't do all of these things in every context, and we'll get to that in a minute. But we wanted to sort of highlight that many of the things that the science of reading tells us would be useful for kids are pretty commonplace, natural things that many of us do. Some are not. Studying word patterns and variations, that's tricky. And we need to learn a lot about word patterns in order to be able to do that well. But many of these things are things that are pretty natural to do. And if you're in an after school program or a sports program, there are lots of ways to build at least some of these pieces in. We often think when we hear about the science of reading that it's really just about teaching kids the code. And that is part of the science of reading. Absolutely, kids aren't going to pick up letters and sounds and how they all fit together into words and words that are irregular on their own. That's not something that most kids hold together independently. They need explicit instruction in that. But there are a lot of other pieces to the science of reading as well. And we really would emphasize this meaning and language piece, because that's the foundation that you see sort of traced all the way through the trajectory of learning to read. And we don't want that to be forgotten in the shuffle. But certainly focusing on code, these attention and motivation pieces, and the meaning and language pieces all come together to support the science of reading. So what you do in your own lives to support the science of reading will depend a lot, exactly which of these strategies you choose to focus on, will depend a lot on the affordances and constraints of your situation, where you are, what you're doing, how you work with kids, how you work with families. A classroom teacher needs to be doing all three of these things every single day. You need a dedicated phonics program. If you're a classroom teacher and you're looking for one, we can give you some advice, and so can other folks on this call. I'm talking to you, Nancy Scharf. I know you got a lot. So you definitely need that piece. But you also need these other pieces as well. If you're an after-school literacy tutor, very similarly, you're going to be doing all three of these things in every single session. If you are an after-school drama program leader, you're probably not going to be implementing a systematic phonics curriculum. You certainly can if you want to, but given what you're focusing on, maybe much of your time will be spent building this meaning and language piece, as well as maybe the excitement about reading and plays and drama and what they do for us. If you're in a summer soccer program, maybe you focus on soccer, but also you'll have lots of opportunity to talk with kids, help them use their own language, describe how they're feeling, and certainly this sort of like building confidence, becoming a help seeker is an important piece of the puzzle for you as well. So we just wanted to sort of lay out the multiple pieces of this, what the science of reading says is important. We wanted to highlight that although there is a lot going on, which is a challenge, there's also a lot of levers that we can pull to increase kids' opportunities to learn about reading. And so we have a couple of questions that we put together for you, which I'll put here. Just wondering, for you all, coming from a variety of different backgrounds, how do these components, these sort of three pieces, fit into your programming? What do you tend to focus on? And if you were to sort of beef one of these up, if that's something that you think makes sense for your program, how would that look? What would you do to incorporate that into your program? On the other hand, we're also happy to do more of a Q&A with you all, depending on what makes sense. So I'm going to ask Alex what he thinks is a good next step for us to give folks an opportunity to weigh in.
Thank you. Yeah, I see a couple of questions in the chat. One from Joanne Fraser Dasent. Do you apply the Howard Gardner theory of multiple intelligence with your strategies in the classroom?
Sure. So that's a really good question. And I'm going to ask Barbara to weigh in here too. So Howard Gardner, Howard Gardner is this guy at Harvard. He's got a theory that there are a variety of different kinds of intelligence. He was actually trained in the cognitive psychology field, I believe, where we often think about intelligence as like three things. So you either have these three things or you don't. And if you don't have them, then you're not intelligent. And all these tests for intelligence were really normed on primarily white middle-class samples, which of course makes it very easy to say, oh, look, these people from other backgrounds don't have these things, and so they're not intelligent. And that's why we don't need to help them with reading. There's no point with that. So a lot of deep-seated historical problems in the intelligence literature. So the idea of multiple intelligence is that people can be good at all sorts of different things, and all these different sort of strengths, inclinations, dispositions, collections of background knowledge, all of these things are important. And I think we absolutely would agree with that. Where we most often see that as being relevant in the science of reading literature is in the area of background knowledge. So if you're looking to try to find out sort of where Howard Gardner intersects with the science of reading, that's probably the biggest piece. So for example, we often find that kids who have difficulty decoding and or comprehending what they're reading have a much easier time of it when they are reading about things that are familiar to them and that they're interested in. Likewise, if you give a kid a text about something seemingly random to them, they may struggle with that because they don't have as much information. So that's one way we see that. We also strongly spend a lot of time with our teachers encouraging them to build kids' background knowledge. So if kids come in and they don't know stuff about fishing, and you're going to do a unit on ecosystems, and they don't know very many words for fish or know much about how fish live and how we eat fish, then you're going to need to talk to them a lot about fishing and encourage them to talk. And so that really takes us back to that meaning and language triangle that we sort of stuck up there at the top. Giving kids information about the world, letting them tell you what they know about the world is one of the absolute most important things that teachers can be doing, according to the science of reading, because it builds kids' background knowledge and helps them understand what they're reading. Would you add anything to that, Barbara?
Just that, first, thanks for the question, because I think it really brings up a major issue in terms of not only what Jenny and her colleague brought together in terms of how people learn and how teaching is, but also the science of learning. Kids learn differently. They really do. And I think one of the challenges in a classroom is you have one teacher and 20-something, 30-something children. So I think that although the theory is important and people should know about it, and all the things that Annemarie said are absolutely true, I just think that in terms of practical implications, things become a challenge in a classroom when you don't necessarily have 5 teachers and being able to implement all those things. So I think, again, really important question and relates to the science of reading, but the science of teaching and the science of learning have challenges being implemented, I think, in the way, operating as intended, that you'd want that to be in a classroom. So thanks for asking that.
And I see we have a few more questions in the chat, which is great. If you would prefer to add them there, please do. I think Annemarie and Barbara, I think if folks have other questions they might like to ask out loud, we can spend a few minutes on kind of Q&A and then maybe move into more open-ended discussion based on the slides that you had. I see one question from Mandy. You mentioned executive function. I find this is something that teachers could benefit from more information on and how to provide interventions based on these skills. Does Temple provide this in their teacher prep program?
We sure do. And I'm just writing a name into the chat. Yeah, so again, sadly, with regard to where the research is relative to what teachers actually need, we know a lot about how executive function skills develop. We know a lot about individual differences. We know a lot about cultural differences, but we don't know nearly as much as we could about exactly what teachers can do in classrooms to support that. One collection of resources that's really helpful is work by Megan McClellan and Shauna Tomini. Megan McClellan is at the University of Oregon. Shauna is at Yale now. Shauna is she's like a children's folk musician, in addition to being a reading researcher or an executive functioning researcher in the area of reading. She's put together this whole really interesting collection of things that teachers can do in classrooms to build executive functioning skills. And they actually have some data to suggest that it works. And you might consider executive functioning as sort of in case it's not a term you're familiar with, the capacity to sort of regulate your own attention and emotion and behavior. And we typically see those skills begin to develop in earnest around the preschool period and then really throughout the lifespan, but certainly into the early 20s. So if you, so I have their names in the chat. If you just look in the chat, Megan McClellan and Shauna Tomini, and they've done some really cool stuff like, so they have some games you can play, like red light, green light, like you're allowed to go, you have to stop. They have a lot of mileage with the head, shoulders, knees, and toes task, where you tell kids, I want you to touch your head. now I want you to touch your toes. And then you switch it up and you say, now when I say touch your head, I want you to touch your toes. That's a behavioral inhibition measure. They've done some work on this drum circle, where the teacher, you don't have to have a bunch of drums, you could have anything, but the teacher will tap out a pattern and the kids have to tap out a pattern. And then there's an inhibition piece that you layer into. So some really cool activities that are fun for kids. And they've actually shown that they do benefit kids' executive function skills. Exactly how much that later maps on to reading and math is still a little bit of a question, but they're doing really cool work. So Shauna in particular, if you look her stuff up, you'll find some good stuff.
And just one thing, Annemarie, just to add on the language. Please. Also, language development, people also have shown that, the more language skills kids have, the better executive function that they actually can, because language allows you to be able to obviously communicate your feelings.
That's a great point.
Like that. So that's in Annemarie's slides. Thank you.
I see another question here from Shelley Dorfman that kind of makes me think of something else that I've heard, both when folks registered for this session and just in general. So she asked, how can we get our families to help with their child's reading? And I think that also speaks to this other question that I've heard around, how do parents specifically kind of talk about this with their kids' teachers? Like, how do we make it real for families and parents?
So Barbara has this really cool project that she has been working on that involves trying to figure out, so I'm going to ask Barbara to talk about it, but she's been working on this thing where teachers can text families about the vocabulary words that are coming up in the classroom. But then she's building these videos that sort of capture for families the ways that you can use this information. So I think she would be able to speak to it's important for families to know this, this, and this. And then I think she's got some information too about what makes the most sense to families and sort of fits with what they already know and are doing. Toss it to her.
So again, thank you. Actually, thank you, Shelley, for asking the question, but also thank you, William Penn, for funding that, because it was an important piece. And I've learned, we've learned, because Annemarie is a part of this, I've learned several things over the past year about what families actually can do. And lo and behold, we actually asked families what they thought, which would probably be a good place to start if we were actually, which made me think about the other question down there, what families know, let's not pretend that I know what the other families are going to be wanting to teach their kids. So we've done a lot of interviews and focus groups with families, and I'll give you the short version, but hopefully can give you the longer version in a paper. The shorter version is be very simplistic in terms of, not simple, but simplistic. Families can't do a lot. That a lot of families have time famines, but a lot of around book reading and being able to reach your kids and talk to your kids. And what families, I think, get confused in terms of talking to kids, it means don't do what I'm doing right now. Talk, talk, talk. Give your kids a chance to be able to do some talking as well. And simple things Annemarie had on the slide before, ask some questions, but hey, wait for them to respond and talk about the meaning of words, because there seems in some ways a disconnect between decoding words and then being able to understand what the meaning of a word is. I mean, you want to be able to decode a word, but you also want to know what the word means. So I think that families could be given, or can be given, and I think are through classrooms are given some instructions in terms of talk about words, do activities with words, do activities with phonics and stuff, but keep it simple, because parents are their children's first teachers, but they're not phonics teachers and they're not reading instructors. So I think that they can do it in very, common and kind way with their kids.
There's also some good evidence. We talk a lot in this country anyway about the importance of reading with your kids. If you actually look at the data on how much reading with your kids predicts their language development, it's only like 8%. So it's not a huge predictor. We're really hot on it. But if you actually look at how much variability in kids' skills it explains, is not a ton. So in addition to reading, we definitely want to think about how families talk with kids and let kids talk. And I think it's important to note that if reading is a challenge for families, perhaps because families are not themselves literate in English or their home language, talking gets you awfully far. And there's some really cool research from NYU on storytelling in families, particularly families who are, from a couple of different Central and South American countries. So storytelling is all in Spanish, but different cultures, telling different kinds of stories and how incredibly powerful that can be for kids' language skills. So that's another way to think about some of the benefits of books if for some reason books are not of interest to families, or there's, just like a little bit of a barrier there for whatever reason. So reading is important, but can be complemented by other things. And of course can be done in any language the family chooses. Absolutely benefits kids' English reading down the road if they are having rich language experiences, reading books in their home language.
So one thing I wanted to just draw upon, we have a lot of folks that have joined us today from our, obviously from the Read by Fourth partner network, and a lot of different perspectives here in the room. And I'd love to see if folks would like to unmute themselves and talk a little bit more about how you see kind of these concepts being applied either during out of school time, or if we have any classroom teachers on the call, how you see this playing out in your own classrooms or at your schools. We'd love to kind of open it up for more of a discussion. If we have any folks who would like to go ahead and unmute themselves. In the meantime, I think that there were a couple of other questions in the chat. I think I missed one earlier from Kelly. Let's see. Kelly Brown, I think you had a question that I'm trying to scroll up and find. Let's see.
Kelly's question was about professional development. And I would highlight the AIM Academy work. So there's another post a little farther down. So AIM Pathways is a series of professional development opportunities. I'm just quoting Caitlin Wood's score. But absolutely, AIM has some absolutely fantastic stuff. Not just about code, although they're the people that I go to when I want to know more about the code and structure of language. But they've been a great resource as well. There's some really intensive professional development through the Drexel program. One really useful program that's out there, particularly around the structure of language. There's a little bit of vocabulary woven in, but really it's mostly about decoding. That's the Wilson language method, which sort of like is a tier 3 intervention, an intensive intervention that builds on the Wilson language program. That is overseen by Lori Severino. She's the trainer at Drexel, professor at Drexel, and she's just the greatest. I took the first piece of it, but it's awesome. It's really awesome profession. It's very in-depth. So like the idea is that you would go and tutor kids in this, but if that's what you're looking for, it's really cool. And Lori's great.
Great. Annemarie, would you mind displaying your discussion questions that you had? Just one
I can
more.
drop them in the chat too if folks would rather see more people.
Yeah, great. And just so folks know, I think we will be sending out, if it's okay with you all, Annemarie and Barbara, the slides from today's meeting. We've had a couple of folks ask for that specifically.
So I might jump in this lull and just ask people again to unmute and share their reactions in this discussion. What is this making you think about? What are the implications for your own work? Anything you're going to take away from this?
Hi, yes, this was wonderful. Thank you both. Thank you so much for this. This was great. I actually am a dyslexic adult, but I also run a nonprofit for individuals, and I actually have a stepdaughter who is dyslexic as well and ADHD. And I actually went through Wilson myself before I went back to college, and I'm actually trying to finish up my Wilson certification. So I know Lori personally, she's awesome. So I do know Lori. My takeaway in this, I love what you said about the storytelling, because now my time is not as much as it used to be. So I cannot go and read every night, but the storytelling is a great way to make that connection and to help her really with her vocabulary, which she struggles with a lot, connecting, just meaning to things and things like that. So I really love that aspect of bringing in storytelling and allowing them to reflect on what they hear or what the story is about or what we're talking about, really to make that connection. So thank you guys so much. This was great.
That makes so much sense. And I think it's a relief in some ways to think about the fact that there are so many scientifically grounded strategies for building kids' skills. It doesn't have to just be one thing. And my own daughter, I've been telling Barbara about this, my own daughter turns out to be dyslexic, hence my interest in the Wilson language program. And so just thinking to having more options available and like the tool belt of things that you can do to help kids is very powerful.
And I can't answer Caitlin's question in the chat, and I feel like I'm probably the gentleman that said that he works at the prison to pipeline. Could be better, but it is a huge issue. It's a huge problem. And it's one of the reasons why I started out working with fifth graders and now do 0 to 5, because I think that the emphasis early on, not that you can't fix things later on, because you actually can. I shouldn't say fix. I apologize for using that word. Not that you can't intervene later on, but I think that the supports get less and less. I mean, when we worked on a project many years ago with exactly the high school population, and many of the teachers just did not have the skill set to be able to address some of the concerns. They're English teachers most of the time, didn't have the skill set to address students that were having problems later in high school. So I think we really, as a community, need to think about ways that we could follow up. And Annemarie, you may know that better than I do.
And one of the, I'm just going back to Annemarie, one of your questions, if you were to choose one element of reading skills to focus on, what would that be? So I'd love to kind of open that up to others. Like what jumped out at you in the presentation earlier about like a specific skill that you might really want to home in on?
Hi, it's Jill Smith. I have been working with adult learners and early literacy for many years, and now am working on a program that supports grandparents who are very involved in the development of early literacy in their grandchildren. And I work for an agency called SOWN. We just received a significant Carnegie grant to expand our reach into elementary school. So Philly Families Read Together is ages 3 to 8, and the expansion of the program from 8 upwards. We're looking for someone to direct that program. Just an aside, but it's a good place to let people know. I've been involved in training tutors who work with adult learners, and I love hearing all of this scientific background. And I agree that all three are incredibly important. I understand, I appreciate the distinction on reading to kids versus talking with kids. And I know that goes way back to some guy in Alaska, Todd, somebody who was sitting in on families to listen how often they spoke. Barbara, do you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's been a while. And I don't know if that's been disproved along with the multiple intelligence, not disproved, but questioned along with the multiple intelligence. In terms of helping families, I can only speak from what I've learned through Philly Families Read Together, is that caregivers, parents, grandparents do need skills. And I think that the fault falls on, if you read to kids, that's enough. But I really appreciate your emphasizing that it's the skills underlying that reading that are key to helping kids do this. I'm an adult with ADHD, and that interfered with my reading in a very different way, but it still was significant. And I'm trying to think, there was one other thing that I just wanted to comment, and I'm so excited that you are here talking this way and giving us this information. And I'm very pleased that you'll be making slides available, because the combination of listening to the tape and reading the slides is best for my learning. And there are just lots of things I want to make sure I pay attention to. So thank you both very much. And Jenny and Alex, thanks for thinking to put this kind of program together with speakers of this caliber and knowledge. It's been very, very helpful. So thank you for that. I guess I sort of advertised myself rather than asked a question, but here you are. It's okay.
No, that's great. You should put your the position that you're recruiting for in the chat. If you
Oh,
have
thank you.
a link to
I
share,
will do that.
this is the right group to share it with.
Thank you.
I think just doubling down on that.
Yeah,
Joanne, you first.
No, you go ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay, I was just gonna say, doubling down on that, I think that it is really helpful getting this information out to a really broad sector of folks. So I'm with Joyful Readers. We're starting a tutoring core that is gonna be providing full-time reading tutoring next fall in Philadelphia schools. But my question, I think for both of you, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I feel like what we're hearing is that we know that for people who are in a position to teach reading, we need to make sure that they have really good training. We need to make sure that they are really ready to do that effectively. At the same time, we're facing a huge national and local teacher crisis where we just aren't going. There are these long-term projections that we are not going to have enough educators, and it's starting to hit now, and it's going to keep on coming year after year. I'm just curious how you think about those two concepts together and what you maybe see as some local solutions.
What you may not know about Barbara is that she is actually also an expert on tutoring and has done some, it was a while ago that she started, but the work that she did, she's been thinking about this for a long time. So she probably has some good thoughts about this. You should take it.
Well, Dave, I'm not sure if you said this word, but I'm kind of terrified about the things that you just said, because we have been thinking about it. And we're also having a dip in college enrollment and things like this. So I think what we're trying to do, and Annemarie really is on the cusp of this at Temple, and I know people at Drexel. I mean, we really are trying to provide the students that leave these programs with the skills that you're describing, because I think the worst thing in the world is to try to get into a classroom and not have the tools that you need to actually work and be able to make kids learn to be able to do the things you're trying to teach them. So the toolkit we're trying to, and Annemarie's been really working at Temple on that. That's very important. But I also, I know this sounds a little kind of hokey a little bit, but I feel like I am an ambassador for, I tell everybody I'm a teacher. I don't tell everybody I'm a college professor. I'm a teacher. I'm trying to say, and all the great things that you, I mean, there's really, and I actually, I guess, kind of try to recruit people in both in my public, but also my private life in terms of, what teachers can and can't do. It is the hardest job in the world, but I also think the most rewarding job. I don't have to convince anybody here today about that. So I think that's also part of all of our jobs in trying to get people, recruited into a great position, but also have them have the skills, as you started the conversation, David, like they need to know what to do when they get in the classroom, and that's on us. And I think we've been working hard trying to do that. Probably not the answer you wanted to hear, but
I think Barbara and I are of the opinion that folks need teachers, pre-service teachers particularly, but certainly in-service teachers and tutors we would include in that, need some pretty specific guidance on what to do. So I think if you're thinking about what is going to make a tutoring program most effective, there are some models out there, and certainly, every program should be a little different because it needs to, focus on the particular needs of the kid and mesh well with what the school is doing and sort of be complementary. But there are some programs out there that have some research on their curricula, and that can be useful to be able to say, like, here's a package that you can use. So, there are. I don't advertise any of them. I'm not on retainer by any of them. But if you would like more information about, what we've looked at in the past and been able to find some evidence on, because after the School District of Philadelphia call to find more providers of tutoring, we did help some local folks figure out who they could maybe go to. We do have a couple things that we found we can share.
Thank you both. Yeah, I'm really hopeful that the science of reading being spread further is in some ways a helpful retention tool for teachers as well, and can really help folks. Maybe it's not yet the way to get people into the profession, but it might be the way to get people to stay.
Joanne, I think you had a question a few minutes ago.
I've enjoyed this thus far, and I'm so glad that you brought up the fact that storytelling is very important in the classroom. And I'm hoping that somewhere along the line, someone create a updated curriculum introducing storytelling in the classroom and have workshops not only for children, but for the teachers as well. How? Because I went in a classroom last week for Read Across America, and I read to a, can you hear me? Can everybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
I read to a group of third graders, and I was just impressed with the way they spoke back to me. They interacted with me, and I'm still in awe to hear that, to hear and know that children are communicating despite this pandemic. Because I was very concerned with them just being online and being taught. I wanted to know, are our children talking back? Are they reading and talking back to us? And that they did last week. And I was just so happy to hear that. And I guess because I'm a professional storyteller and I helped to bring the story alive, I read Thank You, Amu, and Beautiful Blackbird. And it was just amazing to hear those children communicate with me in that classroom. So communication is the key.
We think so. Yeah. We agree. To us, I think it would be fair to say, Barbara, that we see a lot of really thoughtful integration between the meaning language elements of things and the code focused elements of things in very early childhood years. So like toddler teachers are definitely teaching, exposing kids to rhymes in the context of larger units of study on rhymes and letters and such, in the context of larger units of study where they're also teaching vocabulary words that have those same letters, so it's kind of all of a piece in early childhood. And then as we get into the elementary grades, it tends to be a little more fragmented. So for example, you will have teachers doing a code focused program like the Wilson Phonics program, which is lovely. And then they'll pick words to teach kids that have nothing to do, that come from the books that they're reading, which have nothing to do with the code. And so that's, they're covering all their bases, which is a beautiful thing. And you cannot expect teachers to go make an integrated curriculum where everything is seamlessly connected. That is humanly impossible. There's someone out there. You all could probably do it. I couldn't. And we really don't have an evidence-based curriculum that stretches across the elementary grades that does high quality code stuff and high quality meaning stuff with some SEL thrown in a coherent way, so that kids are actually learning about the world and learning to tell stories and talk about things and share what they know and build background knowledge that they don't have. And then using that same content to sort of learn the patterns and words and such. That's the dream. And that's what the science of reading really points to as what would be most effective for kids. For a variety of reasons. And if we could make sure that those themes and that content was culturally appropriate and based on things that kids knew about and things kids didn't know about from different cultures, that's really the dream. We're not there yet.
And also, Annemarie, just to add, we also live in a city that has diverse language speakers. And I think that, we should celebrate that. It always seemed to me to be a little odd that people would teach their kids in 5th grade, put them into a Spanish immersion class, but then not have supports early on when kids come to school knowing a different language, and that there's no way to support that. So I think this idea of trying to support all languages at an early age. Now, having said that, knowing in a classroom how difficult that is, how challenging that is for a teacher who has students that speak multiple languages and is trying to integrate all the things that Annemarie had on her slides. I think we need to do a better job of trying to be able to support teachers and being able to answer, address those needs, address students' needs in that regard. And I don't think we have solved that either.
So we have just a few minutes left, and I want to be respectful of both our host's time and the time of everyone here, and would just love to invite someone who hasn't spoken up yet, to share some takeaways. Like, what is one thing that that you think you'll remember from this session, or one thing that you think you might apply, to your own work or share with a colleague?
This is Joy Diligent from the School District of Philadelphia. I work with the pre-K program, the executive director, and all the things that that was shared are things that we provide to our teachers in terms of working with our pre-K students. But one takeaway for me is the storytelling aspect And even with that question of how can we get families to support, because we do a lot with telling parents to read to their children, and we provide books. But I think for me, I'm thinking like, how do we now encourage them to do the storytelling because of any of the reasons where, maybe they're not able to read the book in the languages, that literacy piece, or even we do try to get some books that have the language, English and another language. But I think I want to more push ahead the storytelling and be very intentional in showing them how they can use that storytelling to be able to support their children in their learning and read and developing reading. So that's my takeaway.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Joy. That's awesome. Whatever Joy suggests is totally going to work because she knows what's going on. One thing that we've thought a lot about with regard to how families can be useful is if you think about the kinds of opportunities that families have at home versus the kinds of opportunities that teachers have. At home, there are fewer children usually per adult than there are in the school. So families really do have a chance to tell stories and talk to kids about things that are particularly interesting to that kid because they know what's interesting to that kid. But I think the biggest thing that families can maybe do in the context of these stories, and see if you agree with this, Barbara, and if you don't, that's cool, is to let kids talk. So to tell a story that kids, so there's some really good literature on reminiscing. So like, remember when we went to the park last week and we did this? Do you remember what happened next? So, creating these opportunities for kids to talk, we're increasingly seeing that one of the single most predictive pieces of classrooms and also homes for kids sort of like learning to read is how much kids actually get to talk and get feedback on what they've said. So to the extent that these stories can create opportunities for kids to talk, they're not going to get that many experiences to talk, that many opportunities to talk in a classroom because there are a lot of kids. But at home, the families can really go 60 miles an hour on that. So that might be one way to sort of frame it, is like start telling a story, have your kid fill it in, get the child to talk at the child.
Well, we are officially at 1 o'clock, and I just want to thank Barbara and Annemarie once more for your time today, for sharing sharing your knowledge with this group. This has been wonderful. And as Jenny mentioned in the chat, just want to thank everyone else for joining us for this very first Lunch and Learn. We're excited to kick off this series and hope you'll join us for the next one. More details to come there. But also please be on the lookout for a follow-up survey later this afternoon to tell us what you thought about this session and to share perhaps some ideas for future ones. So thank you again for joining. And any last words from Annemarie or Barbara?
Thanks for everything you do, making the science of teaching come alive. Thanks for that.
Wonderful. All right, have a great rest of your afternoon, everyone.